Hello, welcome to this Substance Sampler tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to have a look at something which I think is important to a lot of texture artists, and that's how to turn a simple photograph into a material. The Substance Sampler has some very powerful tools to do that. So typically this is what you'll see when you open Sampler, and we're going to go create new. So I've got a flat primitive, a plane set up as my default basically. If you haven't, then down here in the viewer settings you can select which mesh you want to work on, want to preview on. So there's squares, spheres, cylinders, even t-shirts. Okay, so once we've got that done, we're going to start to build up our material. The first thing we need is a photo. Now I've been out this morning and just on my way to the shop, I took a couple of pictures of the ground with my iPhone, and we're going to use those. So let me drag that in. So I've got them here, and all we need to do is drag and drop them into our little stack over here, and it will present us with a little options wizard. Because this isn't a tiling image straight away, I'm not going to use image to material. We're going to use just as a bitmap, because we can use Sampler to do some pre-processing. So I'm going to select use as bitmap and click OK. Now we won't actually see anything initially because this is basically not outputted to the material. So if I get the 2D view up, you can see down the bottom, if I select the layer, we've got nothing going on except in scan. Scan is like the input, that's what it's going to work on. The outputs would be would be processed. Sorry, you know what I'm like. So what I need to do with this first is, obviously it's not a square photo, I need to crop it down so that it is square. So up here we have an add layer, and I'll click on there and just type in crop, and it will bring me the crop filter up, and I can add that in. And this then presents us with a crop option, and we can just dial that down a bit, try and get it nice and square. There is a button which will allow you to make it square, and I'm just going to try and get that in there, get as much of the photo as I can. I'm not being too precise at the minute because it would take me ages. You don't want to watch me fiddling around with minute changes. But we can always change this because it's a non-destructive stack that we're working with. I can always come back here and adjust my crop. Okay, so on top of this crop, you can do lots of other processes. We could, if there was a perspective difference on there, that we could correct for that. Any of the other filters you can apply, but we're going to start with a simple crop, and now we're going to add the image to material filter. So again, at the top, and if I type to material, there we go. We've got a few options. There's the old legacy bitmap to material option, but we're going to use the AI powered one because basically it's a bit cleverer. So let's add that to the list with a double click, and now it's going to go off and process the layers below it. So anytime you make a change to the layers below this, it will recalculate. And basically what the image to material filter does is it looks at your image, it runs some clever algorithms on it and tries to figure out what to output. Now in our 2D window, if we select the image to material layer, it will start to give us some details. So we can look at the base color. If we come down here, we can look at the normal, the roughness, the metallic, there's height channel, ambient occlusion, opacity and specular, and we've got the scan one, which is the input to this layer. Now I see I've got like a line down here which I'm not overly happy with, so I'm going to nip back to my crop. I think I moved that a little far out, so I'm just going to move it in and make sure it's square again, and you'll see that this is reprocessing, and when it's finished, eventually, there we go, we should see that line has gone. Yes, because I'd gone over the edge, my fault. Okay, so there are a few options we can, or tweaks we can make to this filter just to make it behave as we want it to. And we'll go over those in the next section. So I'll talk to you then. Okay, so if we select our image to material layer, we'll see under properties we have all sorts of options to work with, and I'm just going to flip over to the normal channel, or the normal display, and in geometry details we have lots of settings. So we've got the small details, medium details and large details, and we can adjust this to how we want it. So for example, I can take a lot of the very small details out, and hopefully you can see that as I'm doing that, the normal map becomes a bit less noisy. So I have a tendency to bring that down, mostly because, you know, when I'm working with the normal map, I can find that if I've got too noisy a normal, it can really muddy the texture, and you lose detail. You gain detail geometry wise, but you lose the clarity of the actual image itself. So medium details, similar. If we go right down, that will take those medium details out, and if we go right up, it will maximize them, and you know, somewhere just below middle, so that it's not too noisy, is, you know, where I usually want to be. And similarly with large details, although with large details generally I crank that up a bit because I want these large details to pop and, you know, show nicely. Now we can see in the 3D view that when we get in there, it's a little bit noisy. So what I'm going to do is just go to my displacement settings and take my height scale down by a little bit, so 0.1, and that sort of flattens it down a bit so that it's not, you know, quite so jagged. Right, so that's the details, and we can invert the normal here. I believe the default is an DirectX normal. If you want an OpenGL normal, if you invert, you'll see it's inverted the green channel, which will give you an OpenGL normal. I'll turn that off for the moment. Okay, so other things we have a geometry equalizer, so we can adjust that to get different effects as we want to. We've got height invert, so you can actually reverse the height. That doesn't seem to be a good idea in this case. If I go to the ambient occlusion level, we can reduce or increase our ambient occlusion strength, and largely speaking it's going to be dependent upon your tastes. We also have a delighting intensity. Now delighting takes strong light features out of your original image. If we look at our original scan, that's what it started out with. When we go to the base colour, it's looking a little bit different. It's taken some of the lighting out of one of the ends, and that's important. You know, if you've got some really harsh shadows in an image, you know, you don't really want them to be part of your texture. You want your texture to be neutral, to be, you know, unlit, and the delighting intensity can help you adjust that to get where you want to. We also have a roughness level, so we've got a base level, how many variations we want in it, and the variation softness. So let's go to the roughness map. So this is where we are. So if I take that right up, you know, it's going to be a very rough, you know, very little reflectivity, but there's still some in there because we have variations. And if I take that down, you'll see it's just completely white now, and if I take it up, you know, we'll get a few variations in. So just adjust that to, you know, where you want to be. If you want it very shiny, you want a low value. If you want it very matte, you want a higher value. I'm going to go higher because I don't want too much. So we've got some variation softness here, so we can take out, you know, really harsh points, and albedo detail importance. You know, how important is the color underneath to, you know, your roughness. If we take that to 0 or to 1, you will get a slightly different effect. And of course we have an invert down the bottom. So that's a little bit about the settings for your image to material AI. You can play with those, you know, move them around. You know, it's going to be largely dependent upon each image you do. Some of them will be very similar, other ones will be wildly different. You just have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so now we've got, you know, actually quite a nice starting point. And if I come down here to tiling and just turn my tiling to 1 and 1, so that I can just see the image on its own, it's, you know, on its own it's quite a nice texture. You know, we've got, you know, a rocky, stony ground kind of thing. Even though, you know, the image I took was of a pavement or sidewalk, I guess. So that's great, except, you know, as we saw, it doesn't tile. So we've got some really harsh kind of edges. So in the next little section, we're going to transform this from a, you know, very obviously tiling material to a tiling material. You know, a seamless tiling material. Okay, so I will talk to you. Okay, so there are a few options to make these things tile, but I'm going to use the Make It Tile option. So let's use Make It Tile and double click on that to apply it to the top. And as you can see, it apparently becomes quite a nicely tiled material straight away. We've even lost the, you know, the colour influences, you know, from the lighting in the material. So I can click this little eye to turn that off, and you'll see what it looks like. And then I'll put it back on, and then we'll see what it looks like after. There we go. So there is a little bit of issue to it. Let me go back to the base colour. So you can see that there is kind of a trough going around each corner, and that's kind of, you know, fairly normal. But let's zoom in a little bit and see what this does. So if I take this threshold down, you'll see it's unprocessed kind of state. And what it's done is essentially copied, you know, done the quartering. It's offset it by, you know, half, so that each of the corners comes to the middle, and then, you know, we've got a seam down the middle and down the edge. And then when I use this threshold option and start to increase it, it then sort of comes out and fixes that seam in the middle and essentially pushes it to the edge. And you can adjust that until it gets to a point that you are happy with. So these harsh straight lines can be dealt with in a certain amount by increasing smoothing on that. And if I turn that off, you'll see we've got these kind of tram lines going on, and as I increase it, you'll see that they reduce gradually until we get rid of them. The colour equalizer has done our work with the other side for us, with the harsh colours. So somewhere around the middle seems to be a good option, but of course you can, you know, adjust it to your needs. We have a height matching, and if I pop that to none, or we could go minimum, it's probably best if we look at the height map. So that's our height map on at minimum. If I put it at none, you'll see that I get the peaks and the troughs and everything. If I go to minimum, it will look to the minimum displacement and head towards that direction, and otherwise if I go to maximum, then you'll see the white peaks come back, and, you know, that's maximum displacement outwards. We do have some advanced parameters. So chromium influence, we can invert the masks, we can adjust our patch sources a little bit. You see that there's a little circle there that's moving, and similarly on the Y. So you can adjust these, to your requirements. Let me pop those to 0 because it seems perfectly good as we are. And yes, so that's got us to basically a reasonable tiling material. But we still have some issues in that I can see these little white dots, which I don't necessarily want to be there, because if I really increase this tiling up to say 4, that's going to show up our repeating quite a lot. So next what we're going to do is use another tool to take out some of the obvious features which are making this a very obvious tiling texture. So I will talk to you then. Okay, so we want to take out some of these little repeaty features, and we can do that with a clone. So if I click on my add layer here, I can type in clone and we have a clone stamp. There we go. So now I have a little brush that I could use in my source here, and I could press Alt and click to set my source, and then I can brush over some of these little areas to take out that those features. Now don't worry that this is sort of showing up quite light at the moment. That's just showing you where you've painted. It's not showing you the result. If I mouse over to the other pane, you'll see the actual result. So let's take a few bits out. And now we're kind of left with this little kind of arc here, which is causing us a little bit of problem. So what I'm going to do is add a new layer for clone, and I'm going to do this one independently. So again, I'm going to Alt and click to set a source, and then we're going to just dot over that to start to take that out. There's a few other spots that might need it. There's a big patch up here. Look, let's get rid of that. Notice when you go over the edge of the texture that it goes over the bottom, so don't be afraid to go near the edge. It will work. Okay, so that's taken out a lot of that tiling, and it isn't perfect, and I think it really will be. However, it's a pretty good result, and I'm going to use it shortly in just demonstrations as to how I would use it, because I wouldn't use this on its own. I would use it in conjunction with some other textures and techniques to make a sort of convincing ground, essentially. Okay, so let's have a look. Just pop in another couple of clone patches. You can come down and perhaps adjust your values until you get to something that you are happy with. So you can adjust anywhere down here, including the crop, although because I've painted those little filter bits, they're kind of all tied to this, so I'd have to redo that again. Okay, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, so let's pop this back to a more sensible tiling level, perhaps 2 by 2, and see what we're looking at. There we go. Okay, so before I finish this and publish it as a texture, I'm going to use one more technique to add a little bit of interest and variation to it. So we'll do that in the next section, and I will talk to you then. Okay, so next then we're going to publish our file as it is, and then we're going to bring it back in again and blend it with itself. So first of all, if we go to this export button here, this share, I can export as, and I want it to be an SBSAR, and you can pick a directory and give it a name. You can select the channels you want, or deselect the ones you don't want in it, and click export. It's going to ask me to confirm. I've done this already, so it's going to ask me if I want to overwrite it. So I'll just click yes, and you can see that it's doing all its calculations, and eventually it will finish and we'll be able to do something. Eventually. Seems that bar was quicker to start with than it is going to finish. So essentially what we're going to do is break our lovely tiling material and then bring it back together again with a copy of itself to hide some seams again. If you have a particularly obviously tiling texture, this can be very helpful. If your tiling texture isn't quite so obvious, then you might skip this particular section. Okay, so that's finished. Now over here you see I'm in your assets. You'll probably be in starter assets. Let's go there, and then I'm just going to go back to your assets, and you won't see anything here just yet, but if you click down the bottom as to add assets, browse to your folder that you've got it selected in, and then select the SBSAR file, and that will bring it in and make it available over here. Okay, so now we've done that, we've kind of fixed our texture in place. We're going to go to File and New, and now we have an empty stack. Let's get rid of that, and I can drag my texture, which I've called ground, into that, which is, it's essentially a collapsed version of our original. But what I want to do is kind of offset this a bit, and it's going to break the tiling. So let's go to a transform, and let's pop that in there, and we'll just grab around here to find the rotate option. Okay, I've found it now, and so if I go to this transform, I'm going to select my controls to widget and parameters, and now I can see the rotation option. So I'm going to rotate that round, and as you can see, that is breaking our tiling. Not too much, but enough. So what I'm going to do now is reblend this with a copy of itself. So I'm going to grab this ground and drag and drop that into the top here. Okay, so we can see that once we've added that, we've got this height blend here, which is the default, and I'm going to switch that over to a custom mask blend. Now let me in the 2D view start to paint over this. So on our ground, I can activate this paintbrush, and essentially what I want to do is paint over these edges. So I'm just going to roughly paint over those to see what's going on. There we go. Sorry, I was painting them, but I'd started off the canvas, so it didn't like it very much. So as I paint there, we can adjust it. So over here we have things like mask blur. If I come back, it should be slightly more blurry, and let me just go round and round and round until, oops, I get right in there. There we go. So yes, we can blur our mask, we can increase our mask tile. You see the tile, the mask itself is tiling now, which we don't really want in this case. We've got a balance and a contrast, all sorts of things to make it look good. And to judge the result, I can turn this eye off here, and we'll see what our pattern was beforehand, and then if I turn the transform and the mask back on, we'll see what we get afterwards. And of course you can go in and adjust your mask as much as you want to get to the kind of point that you want. Now I'm sort of thinking that actually I don't want to really draw it particularly squarely, because that is going to introduce kind of straight lines that my eye might detect. And I believe if I press the X key and go over that, it's actually going to create a negative mask there, or to erase the mask, shall we say. I think my blur might be messing me up there a little bit. No. Anyway, there we go. So that's come out pretty good, I think. So in the next section, I'm going to go take this into Substance Painter, and we're going to use it to, texture a ground, and then I'll add a few layers over the top of it, which will further go towards removing any obvious tiling that we might have. Okay, so I will talk to you then. Okay, so let us export this. I'm going to click the share button, and we're going to export as an SPSAR again, and we can set our sizes. I'm going to leave it like this and set my channels, they're all good, and let's see what we can do. Right, so it's not an untitled material, it is ground base. Whoops, not brown base, I don't know what that is. There we go, and let's hit export. So this is going to chug away, and it will take a minute or two as it did last time, and I'll probably speed this up so that you're not bored. There we go then. Okay, so now I've done that, I can go to Substance Painter and import it from that directory, but actually what I'm going to do is the easy route and use that publish and simply send it straight to Substance Painter, and that's going to add it to my library. As you can see, it's churning around, and again I'll let this think about it until it's done. Yeah, done. So I've got Substance Painter open, and as you can see, it's added my thing over here. It's called it Untitled because it was basically a resave. So I've got a little scene set up, and I've got various folders which I've added masks to. So I'm going to drag and drop my new material in, and we'll see what it looks like. There we go. So that looks like a pavement, but it's a little bit on the chunky side. So when we come in, what we're going to do is resize it, and then we're going to use some blending techniques to give it some interesting variation. So I will talk to you then. Okay, so I mean the reason this is so large in comparison to our texture is because it's only taking up a very part of our UV space. So let's go to 2D 3D and zoom out a bit. Oh, and undo that, rotate, stop rotating. There we go. So it's only taking up this bit, which is quite a bit. It's less than half the UV space. So on the layer itself, what we can do is go into our scale, and if I double this scale, if it will let me, things seem to have locked up. I don't know why. It's somewhat going wrong. Seems to be back now. There we go. So if I reduce that down, you'll see I get a much tighter, much smaller texture, which is terrific. That looks pretty nice. At 2 level you could go even further if you wanted. Just to say that the further you go, the more tiling you're going to get, and the further you go, the more kind of resolution you're going to lose, because it's going to convert from a 2K texture, which is what we created, and convert it down and then convert it back up again, and you're going to lose something in that process. So I think 3 is probably the maximum I would go for this, but we can see some tiling in it. So what we can do with that is now kind of multiply it over itself. We can add extra layers. So if I add a new fill layer over the top of this, and let's add a black mask, and to that black mask I'm going to add a fill, and in this fill we're going to use a texture. So let's go to the texture folder just to clear that, and I want some sort of grungy texture to put over the top of that. So nothing too drastic. I do want some kind of differentiation, so let's take this one and pop it in our grayscale there, and that's going to put some variation across our top. And all we need to do is decide what sort of variation we want. Now we could just use it to adjust our height, or we could use it to adjust our roughness, or any channel we want, or everything, or we could overlay another material to it. What I am going to do is go and find our ground material, or unnamed or untitled as it is, and I'll add it in. But what I can do now is, what I have done now is actually just left it at its original scaling. So if I turn off the one underneath, you'll see what that's doing. So it's adding this variation in, and I could increase the scale just a little bit because it's a little bit big, but it's not as big a scale as the other layer, which we've gone much smaller. And if I turn that back on, we should see that a lot of our kind of repeating this, or some of our repeating this, has been removed by doing that. And that's just the general process. You overlay and overlay and overlay things. So similarly to that, I can add another new layer, and this time perhaps I do only want to do roughness, and I want to make it a little shinier than the rest, and we can add a black mask to that and add a fill layer to the black mask, and we can pick a perhaps different grunge texture. Oops. To add in some patches of shine, where you get on sidewalks and pavements where it's got wet, or so on and so forth. Let's go and have a look at the roughness there. There we go. So our main is quite rough. Let's turn that off. Our initial was very rough in the first place. Now we've introduced some patches that are lighter, and we can change the parameters on this grayscale grunge texture just to amend that. There we go. A little bit more variation, a little bit more organic, a bit less strict. So let's have a look at our material. There we go. Let's even go and have a look at it under a rendered view to see what it looks like. So you can get an idea of what it looks like in the preview area, but not really a terrific idea of how nice it's going to look. There we go. So that's pretty nice. We started off with a fairly rough tiling texture, and now we've turned it into something that looks like a bit of a sidewalk. Might be a bit brown, but I can adjust that. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this, I'll probably do it in a speed thing, is I'm just going to add some texture to the other zones of this, and then bring them together. So yeah, if you want to watch that, carry on. If not, I'll talk to you in another video.